Greetings, everyone. This is Jeff Payne with the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Study, or as we use it, NESA. Welcome to, I believe, the 14th iteration of the Digital Maritime series, which not necessarily focuses on maritime issues alone, but the wider puzzle that is the Indian Ocean region. Joining us today is another of my colleagues from the NESA Center, our academic dean, Dr. Roger Kangas, who not only has decades-long experience studying Russia's foreign policy, both in its proximity but also globally, but has intense experience dealing with Russia's foreign policy, whether it be diplomatic outreach, military engagement, overall strategic thinking as it relates to the wider Middle East, South Asia, and also and specifically Central Asia. So he brings a wide perspective on what we call the NESA region. And I'm glad he's joining us today. And the question to kick us off, Dr. Kangas, is the following. What is the Kremlin's thinking about Russia's role in the wider Indian Ocean region? Incredibly vague question, but it helps us to kick off some of the overarching ideas. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's good to be with you and good to be part of this dialogue. And I hope we can have an interesting conversation about Russia in the region. And what you start off with is, in fact, a pretty broad question. Not necessarily difficult to answer, but it draws in a number of different threads. Because at least from Moscow's perspective, if we're thinking of the Russian government, the Indian Ocean actually offers a lot of opportunity. It's an opportunity to cooperate with potential partners in the region or existing partners. Russia, before the Soviet Union, had long-standing ties with some of the states in the region, India most prominently. It is an opportunity to challenge the U.S., perhaps done intentionally, perhaps as targets of opportunity when dealing with cooperative efforts in the region. It's also a chance to test its capabilities. Now, in terms of its naval vessels, its military or fighting capacity, and its ability to cooperate with other states. What this last part often leads to, and just sort of a thought for you, is when analysts look at Russia in the region in sort of the worst case scenario, it's, this is going to be malign activity with Russian engagement to try to somehow manage control or partial control in the region, or to have a greater presence. There are even Russian analysts and Russian writers who note, Russia's seafaring capabilities. Well, let's get a reality check here. Two things. One, Russia has periodically looked southward to the Indian Ocean, but over time, and we're talking over 3 centuries, the few efforts where they've tried to actively engage and play a more critical role in the region have quite frankly been limited, and usually in the context of a proxy engagement vis-a-vis the West. Secondly, when it comes to their naval capacity, the Russian Navy is, a respectable fleet in the world, but its priorities are going to be in other directions. Its priorities are towards the Arctic, the Atlantic. If we're thinking in terms of the North and the West, it's to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and access to those markets and those lines of communication, and to Pacific. It's a fleet that has largely been a coastal fleet. There is deep water capability, and yes, the Russian fleet does go through the Indian Ocean, but it's not seen as being able to compete and to challenge other navies yet. And so we see more of a behavior pattern of cooperating, of exercises, of engaging with partners in the region. So it's a strange presence they can play. There's the possibility of engaging more severely and of challenging, but the reality is that it's more about cooperating and finding opportunities.
That's helpful, because from based upon your comments, my first follow-up then is this. there's no surprise that when it comes to the Indian Ocean region, the major non-regional powers that play a role are usually referred to as the United States, which is representative of the wider West. Um, Obviously, the People's Liberation Army Navy and its commercial fleet, and then the Russians. But Russia's always like an asterisk. It's always like the ignored partner. And based on what you just said there, I think maybe the comparison to the United States and to the PLA or to the Chinese is ill-fitting, but maybe it is a better comparison to say what the European powers like the British or the French, possibly even the Germans have done. Um, what is your what is your kind of response to the idea that the Russians have a better understanding than most navies of what their capabilities are in this region? Is it that they don't really think about it, or is they have thought about it and they know exactly where their ceiling is and they don't try to go beyond that?
An excellent question, and in some ways it depends who you ask. In terms of their capabilities and your comparison with the Europeans, I mean that's actually an interesting comparison, because to an extent they will also bring in fleets of single-digit numbers ships to conduct exercises with partner fleets in the region. Of course, as is well known, their security cooperation efforts with India in terms of a former aircraft carrier, in terms, obviously submarine capabilities in the region, the potential of cooperating with Pakistan as well. Notice they're an equal opportunity partner in the region. But these, if you look at the numbers of exercises and you look at the numbers of ships per exercise, these are modest. Effective, but they're going to be modest compared to, say, an American exercise or increasingly the Chinese presence. And so you're right about perhaps decoupling Russia from this U.S.-Russia triad of great power politics in terms of actual capabilities. It's the perception challenge that rears its head on occasion. And you even see this, by the way, in Russian doctrine and in Russian statements, and it was, it's been phrased sometimes, grand ambitions and tactical pragmatism. That is, if you look at their documents that lay out what the Russian Navy can do, what the Russian military can do, it is all-reaching. It can go into different spheres, and these efforts of single vessels, going in the Eastern Mediterranean are highlighted as great opportunities, or in our region, of course, Russian vessels going through the Indian Ocean. But the reality is these are limited by costs, these are limited by opportunities, by availability, because of course Russian assets are going to be deployed elsewhere, and it's rare that you can assign ships to this region for any extended period of time. And so it ends up being this area of practical exercises. And so, to your point, they do know, the operators, I should say, and those who are looking at naval operations in the region and looking at Russian foreign policy in the region do acknowledge that there are limits. And they're going to work within those limits and take advantage of them. But they do see, as we say, tactical pragmatism at play.
Well, then let's transition to the other side of the coin, then, from the traditional military side. You brought up the perception issue, which Russia is always seen as a preeminent power, and I think one of the reasons, especially in the Indian Ocean rim, that it is seen as such is because of its deep, long-standing ties with certain countries that loom large as regional powers. And the two that kind of jump out most prominently, at least from American eyes, are its relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran and its relationship to India. Now, obviously, for the United States, for the West, their relationships with those two countries seemingly are at odds. It's not a natural fit. India, it makes complete sense of it. Iran makes complete sense of it. Russia makes complete sense of it. How deep are the relationships, and how are they changing, if they are, when it comes to Russia's relationships with regional powers?
This is their challenge for the 21st century. There's no question, because the perception of Russia's engagement in South Asia is so much influenced by what we remember and imagined it was in the 20th century. And of course, I've mentioned India a couple times, as have you. Um, India was a non-aligned state during this period. It was not this sort of strategic alliance that you would see, or this, the Warsaw Pact relationship that Russia had with other actors. India was and remains an independent actor, but the security cooperation relationship was strong, as in terms of military assistance, in terms of political support for India. There was a positive relationship. Was it connected with the U.S. tie with Pakistan? Absolutely. This is going to play a role. In the 21st century, this dynamic has changed. Of course, the Cold War, this U.S.-Soviet dynamic is gone. It's now Russia taking over that portfolio from the Soviet predecessor. You still see these ties with India in place. But India is looking at other markets, and one of the differences today is India, of course, is looking at a deeper relationship with the United States. It is engaging, obviously Australia, Japan, other countries, and so Russia is one of several key security partners or actors in the region for India. It is, there are individuals in the Indian government and in Indian, academia and others who still write very positively of Russia, who do not see, in fact, who push back on the idea that they have to somehow choose, that it's not this either or, U.S. or Russia, but rather India can engage with any and all countries to the advantage or the benefit of India. And so that's something that's evolved over time. The relationship with Iran is one we could actually spend the rest of the session on. This has been a love-hate relationship for centuries. Of course, these are countries that went to war, centuries back. The border was delimited because of a post-conflict agreement. And in fact, with the rise of the Islamic Republic in 1979 in Tehran, Russia has played a hot and cold relationship with that country. They were unhappy with the revolution. They ended up having to work with Iran. And of course, as we move to today, their relationship with Iran is partly colored by Iran's dynamic with the U.S. The enemy of my neighbor is now perhaps my enemy. U.S.-Russian relations aren't the best. And so there is a common cause and a desire to see a limited or limiting of U.S. actions in the Middle East, perhaps in the Indian Ocean as well. So you see a greater Russian interest in perhaps pushing Iran forward in certain areas. When we look at anything from sanctions on Iran to some of the challenges that are taking place this very moment, Russia is playing a very quiet game. They're not vocally supporting or opposing, but when push comes to shove, expect to see Russia try to work as best a deal it can for Iran to help strengthen that tie. And one final comment on this in terms of the relationship. Russia is increasingly looking at multilateral organizations through which to engage with the neighboring states. The UN is, I would say the paramount organization, but we see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as Russia's way to engage with South Asian countries now. The other year, it's now been, we're getting on 3 years, India and Pakistan both joined as full members. Iran is an observer member. Russia does support Iranian full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That would challenge U.S.-led sanctions on Iran for sure, but it would also draw Iran closer to Russia through this multilateral structure. Of course, there's another country in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China, that Russia may have to contend with in terms of how it wants to influence these southern states. but this is an opportunity to engage. And so the relationships exist. Are there tensions and differences? Absolutely. But the relationships exist.
So now I have two questions. I'm going to try to ask them both, even though they are completely going in different tracks. So forgive me for that. The first is a more geostrategic question, and it's meant purely and almost overtly for a lot of the alarm bell ringers here in Washington. And that is as you alluded to with the mentioning the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this axis of Asian continental powers, where you have China and Russia with interest aligned becoming closer and then eventually coordinating strategic efforts to oppose the United States and its system of partners and allies around the world. Obviously, Iran would get pulled into that in some orbit. Central Asia would fall under that same orbit. Some states in South Asia and Southeast Asia could theoretically be pulled into that orbit. And also even in like the Levant and theoretically beyond. How real is that to you? As you can tell from the way I asked the question, I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to know from someone who knows, because I'm looking at it purely from the Chinese side of the equation, not the Russian side. I am blank on that. That's the first question. The second question is more in the minutia of security cooperation, and that is the Russians, as you mentioned, are working with the United Nations. They're working through the SCO. But one of the things that's been common and increasingly kind of the modus operandi of powers operating in the Indian Ocean Rim has been to focus on multilateral, bilateral, trilateral, minilateral, whatever lateral you want to use, methods of security cooperation, capacity building, capabilities enhancing methods. The French are involved in this, the Indians do this, the Japanese, the Australians, the Germans, the British, the United States. Pretty much most of the Western countries, or at least the democratically oriented countries in the region, this is their methodology. The Chinese, who are the kind of other side of the coin, they tend to do purely economic and then more overtly traditional security exercises. What are the Russian thinking on this? Are they more in the traditional security realm, exercises, training sessions, or are they getting involved in these things related to illicit networking, drug trafficking, coastal defense, all of these sorts of things? So I'm sorry for those two very different questions, but back to you.
Okay. No, they are indeed different questions. I'll actually start with the second one first. That's a more focused one. Your first question does bring up some broad strategic issues that kind of need to be mulled over. In terms of Russian security cooperation in the region, it's kind of the easy answer. They'll do both. They enjoy the bilateral efforts. Not to be too cynical, but these are wonderful opportunities for the photos, for the leadership handshakes, whether it's Russian engagement with Pakistan or fleet exercises in the region. But they do, and they'll immediately highlight these. They also, though, bring in the multilateral component. The peace exercises of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are a great case in point. The exercises they'll conduct even with the Chinese fleet in the region, and then perhaps having another country partner or participate in that to show multilateralism is part of how they'll engage. It's interesting that the rule of thumb, and not necessarily hard and fast, is if it's a bilateral exercise where Russia can definitely be the premier actor or the partner, that's a good opportunity. One, it shows or highlights Russian capabilities. It also then perhaps might elicit more business or more cooperative efforts from that host nation or partner nation. If Russia is not the key or significant player, and obviously that would suggest an exercise with China, multilateralism is preferred. Then it's diffused, the relationship, it's not simply, there are Russia-China exercises and Russia-China engagement efforts, But in these other areas or other regions, the multilateral is key. And so, you'll see both of these efforts continue on. In this broader geostrategic question, because this does tie into how Russia sees the SCO, it's an opportunity, and it's an organization that they were present at the founding, as the Shanghai Forum, Shanghai Five back in the 90s, and as it expanded in this past, in the early 2000s with Uzbekistan joining, and now with India and Pakistan joining, with the range of observer members and partner states increasing, it is touted as the significant Asian security organization, period. And Russia promotes that narrative when it's convenient. Here are the few caveats, and this is why I share your skepticism in the, not the longevity. And I actually see the SCO lasting, and I see the SCO being effective, but it's effective in specific lanes. First and foremost, it is not a collective defense organization. There is no, Article 5 measure here where states would come to the aid of others. This is not NATO. This is also not the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is the Russian collective defense structure with its neighbors, with some of the neighbors. They don't want to push it in that direction. They do not want to be involved in more than really that one collective defense structure. So whereas the Chinese have periodically floated this idea, the other states in the organization, Russia included, have generally been cold to that. And so already we're seeing a limitation on its military capability or bandwidth. It emphasizes, of course, terrorism, extremism, separatism, and the exercises they conduct tend to be of a CT nature, even though they appear to be geared for state-on-state conflict, but they call these CT exercises. It's a chance really to exercise with others, but we're going to see them in limited capacities. It's also how much they spend on the organization. The SCO, does get the support of the participant members, but when Russia, when you look at Russian commitment to it, and I would actually make the same claim to the Central Asian states, they invest in other structures. Russia's going to put more even into the United Nations than they would into the SCO, definitely more into the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So in a number of ways, the SCO, it's important for them, but again, there's going to be limits. The last element in this with respect to the geostrategic importance, and for me, this isn't necessarily the Russian view, this is now Roger's view, of why do I see it perhaps maintaining this limited status. The mission. What's its mission? What's its goal? And you find that each country has a slightly different interpretation of this. There's not a nice, neat, single focus that at least, NATO, one can argue today it's had these challenges, but back in the day and when NATO was in its formative years, there was a focus. Same with the Warsaw Treaty Organization. For the SCO, is it economic? Is it political? Is it military? Is it cultural, educational, person to person? And if the answer to all of these is yes, then you have a problem. And in fact, the answer is yes to all of these. We're seeing opportunities to engage, to talk about things. Arrangements and agreements in this framework still tend to be bilateral or sub-regional. And I think as a forum, the SCO will continue, but as a vehicle to really become a security structure, I share your skepticism.
Well, yeah, just from my own edit here, the looking at China's Belt and Road, which when it was initially stood up, 5 or so years ago, the emphasis was on overland transport, overland connectivity through continental Asia. But the MSRI, the maritime component of it, has become preeminent in the conversations about the Belt and Road, just because China has learned, just like every other power, that maritime connectivity and maritime transport for trade is far more efficient than overland routing. And so it has kind of changed the mindset about how China prioritizes its relationships in continental Asia. But that's, again, just my edit. But a final question for you, and you've brought this up as well in your statements, but it's more like a kind of the inverse from the Russian point of view. For the United States and Japan and Australia, India, somewhat the European Union, they're warming up to the concept. This idea that the Indo-Pacific is the future. Now, not everyone agrees on what the Indo-Pacific means. I refer to it as east coast of Africa all the way over to the eastern straits in Southeast Asia. But everyone recognizes that these two geographic areas, whether you define them by the maritime space or whether you define them by the littoral rim areas, is the future of kind of global geopolitics, of global geoeconomics, because there's just so much energy there. You have rising economies, you have modernizing states, you have young populations that are going to change everything. I've heard, and I don't know if this is accurate, but from the Russian point of view, just as the Indian Ocean is going to be a key conduit for connectivity, not only today, but definitely more so in the future, the Russians see this same way about the Arctic Ocean, that because of climate change and the kind of perma ice caps, impeding maritime transport, those no longer being a problem, and just the sheer bonanza of natural resource wealth that is available in the Arctic, that this is the space, is what Russia sees as the key for their economic, political, and strategic future. Do you agree with that assessment, A? And then B, is the Arctic going to remain a niche issue, or will it become more predominant in terms of global trade routes? Because right now, the countries that talk about Canada, Iceland, Norway, the United States and China to a certain degree, but Russia is the kind of leading voice on this. It's more, no one really knows yet what it means, and everyone's just kind of rushing to position themselves. So what are your thoughts there?
No, this is it's a good direction, because in fact it sort of ties back to something right from the beginning, which when Russia looks at the maritime world, they do see them, not just physically, but geopolitically connected. And that is something, for an American, it's not to say hard to capture, but we're used to looking at things in commands and areas, right? We talk about Indo-PACOM and CENTCOM. And yes, Russia does have administrative divisions within their military and in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and when they look at the world, but they see connections and they see trade-offs. And so operations that are taking place in one part of the world may have an impact in another region, and they're going to look to see and measure the significance of that. Engagement in Syria has an impact elsewhere, case in point, or Ukraine. So in the maritime space, again, if they want to expand beyond the coastal realm, beyond protecting their borders, they do tend to look in the Black Sea. Mediterranean is becoming much more significant. Black Sea is a coastal region. The Caspian Flotilla, which used to be the backwater of the Russian Navy, is actually now a quality place to get employment. If you're a senior officer there, that's a good thing. The Arctic is, as it's opening up, is becoming more important. And and this gets to your point, they do see it as an area of expanded opportunities in terms of their defense. Now, the warming of the seas, the changing of ice shelves or disappearance of ice shelves has actually been a catastrophe in some regions. The permafrost is liquefying, and so facilities that were based on permafrost are actually having problems, whether it's oil fields or military bases or people's homes. And so Russia does look to concern with the Arctic. Now, they have engaged within the Arctic Council, whether you think of the A5, right, the the states that actually border the Arctic Ocean, or the others in the Arctic Council, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, technically don't have a border in the Arctic Ocean, but are Arctic nations, if that's the way to phrase it, too landlocked from the Arctic perspective. All look at this and all have debated this in terms of a commons, with specific geographic zones around their countries. Russia would like to see an expansion of its zone. A number of years ago, of course, they had the mini sub that planted the Russian flag on the North Pole underwater, so they could claim it as theirs. But getting into the battle of who owns what undersea shelf is going to be a nightmare. And so the usual mechanism in Arctic discussions has been, coastal usage and then common discussion on the utility of the remaining space. Now, you have the camp that says economically exploit, and you have the camp that says save the environment and limit exploitation. The Antarctic model, let's keep this region pristine because it has an impact on the wider climate of the world. That discussion is now taking on a broader context. China wants to be a member and part of this discussion. Should other countries, friends of the Arctic, so to speak, be part of this? And their engagement is to be part of trade routes and to expand these. And this now finally gets to your question. The trade route discussion obviously has been around for some time. The practical trade route discussion is fairly recent. To date, Russia sees this as a limited opportunity. They'll assess fees if ships travel through this region. Perhaps Russian pilots might be needed in certain zones, which would add an extra fee. And obviously, a surveillance quality comes in with that. And so their goal, their task is to say slowly, and when we can and when we should, maintain and manage control of it. I don't expect the Russians to see this as a superhighway or, as you've said, regarding the Indian Ocean, this as a broad free trade zone where, ships from all countries of the world can pass through. Particularly in the Russian coastal regions, they do not want to see the Indian Ocean replicated. They would rather it be managed, controlled. Now, what Canada does with its portion is up to Canada in terms of the economic development and in terms of trade routes. But I would expect that Russia would remain rather cagey about its regions. That could change in the future, but that's been the perspective coming out of Moscow for the past few years.
Well, that's helpful because honestly, I don't specialize in the Arctic, and there's a lot of speculation about what it means and everything like that. So that's incredibly helpful. I think really that is the questions I had. I appreciate it. There's a wide range of issues we reviewed. So to wrap up, just thank you again for carving out time, for providing me an education, and then hopefully for all the audience an education for them. As you know, we send this out to our network throughout the world, as well as our relationships institutionally with other research institutions, think tanks, and so forth, as well as government departments and sections as well. So, Roger, I appreciate you carving out time. Have you back sometime in the future. And with that, to everyone watching, farewell and have a great day.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you.